Well, welcome everybody. Commission, welcome very much. Thank you very much for being here. I will tell you a little bit about my PhD thesis, what I've been doing these past 3 years, and I hope to enjoy it as much as I have. So, first of all, we start with an impression of what the market, or many of you might have, is the unequal fight between data security and humans. So there's human error on one side and data security with all the infrastructure over there. So he tells that there's firewalls and all types of software against human error. I'm going to debunk a little bit this position, and is part of what I expect you will agree with me at the end. So the outline of this process will be I will tell you a little bit about how this came about, an introduction to the topic, and then I will talk about the research questions, how they came about as well. Then the methodology that I used to answer these research questions, to then tell you a little bit about the results, and then what the implications of the results are to theory, academia, and industry. And finally, I will conclude telling you a bit what is going to happen afterwards, after the PhD, where this is going. So to start off, cyber attacks have been defined as early as the early 90s, particularly by the military in the US, as offensive maneuvers that are targeting computers or information systems to steal, alter, or destroy. With this definition, this very early definition in the early 90s, we could say, or we could have assumed that cyber attacks were IT's domain, so the domain of information technology. And this was largely true until the early 2010, when Stuxnet was discovered. This was a big event in world history in terms of cyber attacks, because this came about with some symptoms that had not been seen before. For example, there was a higher than usual equipment failure at a nuclear plant all over Europe, but particularly in Iran. And this came with no error signs from the control systems. So there was something that did not make sense. And this resulted in a higher than usual equipment damage. These were the symptoms. What had happened after the investigation had been done? In a nuclear plant, you normally have a cycle of control where you have a centrifuge rotation speed that you need to maintain, and this is maintained by a control system. This is a control loop which has sensors and has velocity controls. This one senses how quick it's going. The control system does something about this sensing speed and adjusts the velocity. And this is the normal control loop. However, a cyber attacker came in the middle, and he took over the rotation speed information and blocked what the sensor was telling the control system from the plant. And the cyber attacker, with his software, told the control system that everything was fine. So even though the centrifuge was rotating more and more quickly, with higher speeds, the control system continued to increase its velocity, thereby resulting in the failure of the system. So why is this important? It is important because if we conceptualize the supply chain as a layer of physical activities that is supported by a layer of information and information flows, what happened here is that the hacker got in the middle and created something in the physical world. So now we were seeing somebody who could access the information layer and could eventually have an influence in the physical world. That's why it's so relevant. So this is an increasing problem. So we've seen the number of attacks increase over time. This is a graph that shows the attacks in hacking, malware, or other types of attack over the years, and it clearly shows an exponential increase. That's one of the things that we've been coming across. Another example is which is a adjunct industry, but tells you a little bit about what the status is the average cybersecurity insurance gross premiums. These have also been increasing exponentially over the years. So there is an increasing requirement of companies to take care of what cybersecurity could eventually lead them to, what costs it could lead them to. And additionally, this is a graph which shows the types of informations that are used in supply chains. So we have structured data to very unstructured data, and volume and velocity, so very low volume and velocity to very high volume and velocity. And we have a whole spectrum of different types of data that is being managed today by supply chains. So this is a very complex environment. So all of this led us to a research question which had to do both with before a cyber event occurs and after a cyber event occurs, which is how can cybersecurity and cyber resilience be managed in the global supply chain. This is not an easy question to answer, so it cannot be answered directly. What I did was to identify two first research sub-questions which I would go and pursue before I would answer this question in depth. So the question had to do with what we know. That was the focus of both research sub-questions. And the first question had to do with what are the supply chain cyber resilience frameworks that are published in literature. That's the first one. And second, what case studies have been published? So what frameworks we have to manage cyber risks or cyber attacks, and on the other side, what cyber attacks have been recorded so that we can learn from them. So that's what I set out to do first. So this was my first part in the research. So the literature review that I followed would combine three areas which I identified to be the central areas around this problem. There was on one side supply chain, risk and resilience, and information technology. And the intersection of these three areas of knowledge conform the supply chain cyber risk and resilience framework. That's where I went and did the research first. And the proposed method was a structured literature review that combined search in the three domains that you see here, and used a framework of systems thinking to identify gaps in literature and therefore identify where I would continue my research after that. So I came across the following. I came across, first of all, I did a search which resulted in over 300 articles, which after exclusion criteria and content that was associated with those articles, I came to 62 articles, which most of them had to do with journal papers. Over 80% of them were journal papers. And there has been an increase over the years in the number of publications. The publications ranged from the year 2000, which were the earliest ones I could find with cyber risk, to 2017. And the synthesis sample, which is the sample that I got at the end of the literature review process, considered the following methods. Most of them were descriptive, over nearly half of them. Simulation were 15%, and case study were 13%. So those were the main methods that were being used in those frameworks that had to do with cyber resilience that were published in literature. So an answer to the first research question was that I got 16% of the results I got were descriptive, 12% quantitative, and 72% normative. Some of the frameworks have been named here, but what is very relevant is that the papers in the sample of the supply chain management papers, for example, 50% were descriptive. So it's very much towards the descriptive side. In contrast to that, over 60% of the IT, the papers related to information technology, were quantitative. So there is a big discrepancy on how supply chain management is facing or trying to understand the problem of cyber risks, and how IT is trying to understand it for the same domain. And the analysis that I did was also with respect to systems thinking. That's why descriptive has to do with the events, normative has to do with patterns, and quantitative has to do with structure, which are the three levels of analysis in systems thinking. Well, that was the first research question. And the second research question had to do with which case studies had been published. And the information was just as restricted. We got a number of different case studies that had been published, but only 13% of them had a case description to them. 80% were in the supply chain management domain, and only 3% had a causal structure. So none of the case studies that were published were explaining how the event happened. Only 3% of them did. And another important aspect is that the median time from case to publication was 4 years. If we take the average time, it goes up to 6.5 years. So what happens here is that from the moment the case happened until it was being reported and published, there were 4 years that were passing. And for cyber risks, this is much too long of a time. So what were the gaps that I encountered? I grouped them in three areas. The first type of gaps had to do with the cyber risks that were being managed. So there were gaps that had to do with the long reporting cycles, which I was telling you about. There's unreliable reporting of incidents, so the incidents are being reported only not completely. And there is an underreporting of incidents that has been reported by several authors. And there is a mechanism, there's no clear mechanism of action from the cyber risk to the disruption itself. Additionally, there is another concept, which is the gap, which has to do with the methods that were used. So there's problems with compartmentalization. So the methods that were being proposed until now, they are only IT, or only have to do with finance, or only have to do with the supply chain. So they don't, they are very compartmentalized, that's what I mean. The other thing is the static frameworks. That means that they don't take time into consideration or take dynamics in a very rude understanding, which I will go into later. So time is not a relevant factor for these frameworks. Third, they are highly historical, so they depend on past information. And if we think about cyber attacks as something new that's happening and for which we don't have a lot of history, then historical methods have a deficiency. And fourth, the suitability of methods. So the methods have been proposed, but they have not been identified the areas where they work better or how they should be applied. And the third gap has to do with the people using the methods. In this case, it has to do with the difference in knowledge between the attackers and the people being attacked. There is a high difference in terms of the knowledge of the systems and of the types of vulnerabilities that they can access. So those were the three gaps. And given the time, I decided to concentrate on the two first gaps. The first one having to do with the risks being managed, the nature of the cyber risks themselves, and second, the methods being used. So how can we address compartmentalization, static frameworks, historicity, and so on. So having given an answer to the aspect of what we know, I continued then with the first of the derived research questions, which had to do with how do cyber risks cause operational disruption, and how does this differ from other supply chain risks. So I wanted to probe down into the nature of cyber risks. And this is what I went on and do. Research sub-question number 3 then, which had to do with operational disruption and the difference from other supply chain risks, I divided into 3 steps. The first was exploratory. So I looked first at what cyber events with operational disruption have been recorded. Descriptive, it was a second step, which had to do with how have these cyber events resulted in operational disruption. So what is the mechanism that leads from a cyber attack to a physical disruption? And third, evaluative. So how do these mechanisms, or how do these cyber risks differ from other supply chain risks? And the proposed methodology to achieve this was again a literature review, but this was a search beyond scientific literature. So since I had already searched journals and conference papers and did not find much, I decided to go beyond scientific literature and challenge a little bit the sources of information that we are using traditionally, because of the speed at which these events are happening, and therefore the convenience of trying to obtain other sources of information. And then identify structures that lead to structured behavior to finally compare these structures and mechanisms with other supply chain risks that we know more about. So first, the exploratory part. This was done through a literature review, which was carried out through search databases, normally associated with newspapers, ProQuest and Google News. This was done over the years, over the 3 years that I have been here as a PhD. So I followed the news from the first day in my PhD until the beginning of the year. So it was around 2 years and a half. From that, I got 2,400, a bit over that, over 2,400 reports of different cyber attacks that had happened. And reviewing the sources, so attempting to have some objective validation of the sources, and the inclusion criteria, so what information these articles contained, I narrowed that down to 950 reports. And when I did that, after that, I reviewed the documents in detail to identify those that actually caused an operational disruption. I came down to 54 reports from the 2,400. So only 54 reports actually represented an operational disruption. It was a very low percentage. Most of the reports came from newspapers, and the other came from specialist reports, so almost half and half, and a few reports from university sources, also university reports. And these are some of the newspapers that I got the information from: International Business Times, Register, and so on. So there wasn't only one source, and some of the validation that I did on this stage had to do with obtaining the information about an attack from more than one source. I didn't take only one source as the only source of information. So what did I get here? I got 2,400 events. 5.4 of them led to operational disruption. And most of them, of the reported events at least, had to do with United States and United Kingdom as the two biggest targets. This doesn't say anything about the state of attacks in the world in general. It's just a result of the data that I was able to collect. But since it was exploratory, it's not relevant if this really represents what's happening outside. We're looking for examples. So this is the exploratory part. The descriptive part, so we use the information that I got from these 54 reports to identify now how these cyber events resulted in operational disruption. And here again I used the systems thinking framework by identifying these dimensions of disruption type, if it's either resources, product, or operations; hacker protagonism, if it was an active protagonism or a passive protagonism. I'll have the examples now to show what active and passive means; the approach, if it's targeted and non-targeted; and the influence that it has on supply chain, so if it's downstream or upstream in the supply chain. And through this, I got 5 groups. The first group has to do with the active set of assets. The second is the passive set of assets, or resources, assets or resources. The third is the active product theft, and then active and passive interruption of operations, depending on how this attack was carried out. So this is has been grouped by resources, product, and operations according to the model that has been proposed by Martin Christopher as the definition of an agent, which is an agent in a supply chain is that which combines resources and activities in order to generate products. So an example of one of the groups that I identified is active set of resources. So we look here at the example of an interaction between a customer and a supplier, which is intermediated by a bank. In this case was Tesco Bank. This is open information, so it's not necessary to keep it secret. In this case, the normal operation would be that the customer instructs a payment to Tesco Bank, and the bank pays the supplier, and then the supplier delivers the product to the customer. Here, the Tesco is in blue because Tesco is the one that's being targeted as for an attack. What happened here when Tesco sends information, balance information back? What happened here is that a hacker got in the way, and he obstructed the information signal from the customer to Tesco Bank and sent instead its own information signal. And what this resulted in is that the product was not sent to the customer, but was sent to the hacker. So this was a way of accessing products. In this sense, this was an active intervention because the hacker had to send the information to Tesco Bank specifically. It did not send out a random or a mass email that anybody could act upon. So by obstructing the regular communication paths, it was able to use the system, what the system already was doing, to get the product for himself. So that's one example of an active theft of resources. Another example is the passive theft of resources. Here we have the example of Leoni AG, which is a cable manufacturer in Germany. So what happens here is that there's a CEO, a CFO, and the warehouse, which are the main actors in this event. The normal operation the normal operation for them really would indicate that the CEO instructs a payment to the CFO, and the CFO generates the payment order to the bank. Here, the one that's being targeted for attack now is the customer, so the Leoni, not the bank anymore. And when the payment instruction is given, then the payment is made to the supplier, and the supplier delivers the product to the warehouse. What happened in this cyber attack specifically? A hacker got in the way again, and it created a false email that was sent out to the CFO, posing as if it was the CEO. Therefore, this information path here was not actually what happened. It came from the hacker. And then the CFO just activated what he had to activate, and he paid the hacker, because that's what the instruction that was given by the CEO, the bogus message. In this sense, this was a passive theft of resources, because the hacker sent out an email, and whichever CFO reacted just activated its own structure in order to pay them back. A similar effect as this we could see in ransomware, where an email is just sent out, and whoever receives this email and the data gets encrypted, they have to react. So that's why it's passive. The hacker is not actively doing something. Like this, we also identified active and passive for the operations disruption and for the product for the product theft. So this gave us some ideas of how these attacks result in operations disruption. So we are now identifying mechanisms through which hackers convert cyber attacks into physical disruption itself. The third part has to do now with how do these cyber events differ from other supply chain risks. And here what I did was identify some examples of supply chain risks and compare these to what cyber attacks are, or what they do. And I found 7 dimensions where they are quantitatively very different. The first of all is latency. So a cyber attack can be active and can be waiting to have an effect permanently until it's detected. Instead, another type of supply chain risk, like an earthquake or supplier malfunction, for example, they are quickly detected. They don't have nearly the same latency as a cyber attack. Anonymity. The cyber attacks are anonymous, while the physical attacks or other supply chain attacks, they tend to be traceable. So therefore, the anonymity is something that they are working against. Instead, cyber attacks can benefit from technologies like blockchain, where you have anonymity but traceability at the same time. So there's something with anonymity that distinguishes cyber attacks from other types of attacks to supply chains. There is a component versus interaction difference. In terms of the physical risks, the failures happen at the components themselves. For example, there is a road that is not viable because of an earthquake, or there is a supplier that's not working because something happened with the internal structure. Instead, the interaction is the important part for cyber attacks, because the computer programs, they do not make mistakes. They just are programmed to do something that we don't want them to do. And that interaction between agents is the one that distinguishes cyber attacks. Well, and so on. There's a perpetuity, replication, complexity, and physical location, which are other dimensions which distinguishes cyber attacks from other types of supply chain attacks. So this gives us an evaluation of how do cyber events differ from other supply chain risks. And therefore, we have a question for research question number 3, which now lead us to the last question, which has to do now with the proposals of methods. So how can systems approach be used to mitigate the aspects that I spoke at the beginning? Compartmentalization, static frameworks, and historical dependence for managing cyber risks. So those are 3 dimensions I want to investigate through systems approach. And for that, I am going a little bit back, the supply chain, the systematic literature review gaps, it resulted in this research question, which has to do with systems approach. And I separated this into 2 approaches. The first one has to do with risks. So I went and looked at the risks. So I used systemic risk analysis to do this, and then compared this systemic risk analysis with another established risk analysis method. And on the other side, I looked at resilience, and then I looked at system dynamic simulation for an event of a cyber attack, but looking at dynamics now for resilience. So in this case, the proposed methodology for the first part, which has to do with systemic risk analysis, was to do a case study based on the STPA systemic risk analysis method. This is STPA, this is the Systems Theoretic Process Analysis method developed by Nancy Leveson and her team at MIT. And through that method, I identified unsafe control actions in a specified system. And these unsafe control actions lead to certain requirements that would have to be implemented in order to avoid those unsafe control actions. And then last, comparing this traditional risk analysis method with something that's more established like FMEA. This is based on the conceptualization of a system as a control system. If you remember the example I showed at the beginning with this control system for the nuclear plant that had been accessed, this is the same thing. We have a controller here that has control actions to a controlled process. And this fits back into the controller so that it knows what control action to do next. So this is an ever-continuing loop. And that's how the STPA conceptualizes a system. So in order to do this, what we have to do first is define what system we are going to analyze. And then identify 3 things from that system. First, the accidents. The accidents are not the cyber attacks. The accidents are those events that the cyber attacks lead to, which are undesirable for the company. So the company is not looking to avoid cyber attacks. They are looking to avoid loss of products, loss of customers. That's what they want. The cyber attack is a medium for not obtaining that. So those are the accidents, what the company wants to avoid in the end. Then the hazards, what are the conditions that would lead to an accident? And then the control actions. What is under the control of the agents in the company in order to make changes in the company? Those are the control actions. Then, through a combination of this, which is a very structured process and a well-identified process, we identify the unsafe control actions. So how these control actions can become unsafe, creating hazards and therefore leading to accidents. That is a general idea. And from these unsafe control actions, we arrive at requirements that a company should fulfill in order to avoid these accidents. Now, these requirements, they can be either fulfilled by an IT system, they can be fulfilled by a human resources system. It's irrelevant the way in which you solve them, but this is what you really need to do. IT is just a medium, one of the options for getting to that. That is the beauty of this system, is that it steps away from the infrastructure itself, and it goes back to the actual requirements that the company is looking for, what it wants to maintain. And then with these requirements, the system is redefined. So this is, in general terms, how the methodology works. And the cyber risks are identified in this step of the process. What we did there, we did 20 interviews to 3 warehouses from the same company, people from different areas of the company, from supply chain management, finance, warehousing, quality, and supplier, and even one supplier also. And we identified the following 6 accidents, which is the erroneous arrival of product, erroneous payment to supplier, product loss, product integrity compromised, and so on. So those are the things that the company wants to avoid in the end. And this is the hierarchical control diagram that was the end result of a process of working through the interviews and with the interviewees generating this process control diagram. This process control diagram shows the different agents that are involved, the plant, the supplier, the plant's bank, supplier's bank, and the transport, and all the different actions that are carried out between them. So here we have a complete mapping of all the control actions, and then we went out and see, okay, how do these control actions become unsafe? And what were the results? We identified, well, 6 accidents and 6 hazards, but then 27 control actions and 119 ways in which these control actions can become unsafe and create one of the accidents that we are trying to avoid. And these unsafe control actions, 37% were wrong timing, not given, so that there is an action that should have been done and wasn't done, 18% of them, and were given incorrectly, almost half of them. So that's one of the results. And from the analysis, we came to the definition of what is called the endogenous exposure, which is a property of a system of not fulfilling its objective because of the triggering external or internal of an internal design flaw. So here we are saying that an exogenous exposure is a way in which a company is open to being vulnerated or being attacked because of its own internal design flaw. So we are turning our view inward. We also I propose also a way of quantifying this exposure, both at the level of the hazard and at the level of the accident. So the level of the hazard, the probability of that would be the number of contexts that create a hazard divided by the total number of contexts. Here the number of contexts being the unsafe control actions possible. And in this way, you can identify how open a system is to being attacked or to being accessed unwillingly. And this can be either external or internal. So it's an endogenous way of looking at exposure. And the requirements that I identified from the analysis of the unsafe control actions, I also arranged them in order of the processes that have to do with stock or processes that have to do with flow. Again, from the system dynamics perspective. So if we have everything correct, that is the operation that we want. But if we have incorrect flow processes, but correct stock processes, we have things that have to do with sequences. So we have incorrect sequences, or we have processes that are flawed. Really, it's not the sequence the problem, is the actual components of the process that are not correct. If on the other side we have correct flows but incorrect stocks, then we may have data corruption, so there is something wrong with the data, or there is an identification problem. So they are not able to identify who you are talking to. So it's not even that's wrong, you don't know who it is, or you cannot confirm who it is. So you are sending data, for example, or you are sending money to somebody who's not your supplier. That would be an identification problem. And you have, I also identified a mixture of the two. These both stock and flow process problems, which, for example, unconfirmed processes, things are going forward without confirming who is doing what, and untimely decisions. So you are giving a payment before confirming that the supplier is actually the entity that you want to pay something to. So in terms of the results further, which is a comparison with the FMEA, failure mode and events analysis, it was very clear that the number of hours or number of resources needed was much smaller in STPA. The risks uncovered were many more, and the requirements were also more. So it was a more effective process. But this is not something fortuitous. It has some factors that lead to this. And one of these has to do with the structuring of the process, which FMEA has a specific structure, but it doesn't go as deep in looking for reasons as STPA does. There's a systemic thinking, which is going beyond the cascade event logic and looking at what are the surrounding aspects that lead to a failure. There is dynamic thinking, so we are looking at events over time. Dynamic means over time. and this has to do with things that should have done on time or were done late, and those things increase the number of unsafe events that are identified. And we also, the STPA goes beyond human failure by stating that a human failure is just a way of getting out of a design error. So any human failure or human error is really the lack of competent design. So the options that are open to the human operator depend on the design and the environment in which it's operating. So that is something that the STPA brings out. The human error is not something that is one of the reasons that is acceptable. So the methodology for the second part now, which has to do with the system dynamic simulation, the proposed methodology was also a case study with a primary and secondary data sources, both interviews and records from the company. And what I did here is a dynamic process description by using the case study with a dynamic process description and identifying feedback loops, creating what's called a hierarchical control structure, and then proposing a system dynamics model that I simulated. And this followed the typical cycle of system dynamics modeling, which starts with problem articulation, dynamic hypothesis, formulation, testing, and policy design. And this was done with only one company, but with 5 different persons in the company, which is this is not the number of people interviewed, but there was recurrent interviews. There was not only 5 interviews. And this is the case of a company that had been attacked and therefore lost IP during the attack, intellectual property. And it had 3 stages of reaction. The first one was the incident triage. So this is the moment when the company assessed what the damages were and contained the damages. The second was the incident management. So they started to do some changes, structural changes. And the third part had to do with the recovery phase, which normally had to do with legal actions that were a result of the attack. The event, which happened at year 0 in this case, had consequences until 5 years after the event had happened. So from this, we also got from them what's called the reference mode. So what is the behavior that we want to reproduce in the simulation model? And in this case, the reference modes were the sales and profit gaps. The sales gap recovered very quickly, or quicker than the profit gap, and the profit gap took longer to recover. So that's one of the things that we got from them. And another thing that we worked with the people there, and I worked with the people there, was the identification of types of feedback loops. And if we looked at the performance level, which in this case is the sales or the profit, this performance level had a performance gap increased through some reinforcing loops that we were out to identify. But and those reinforcing loops served to increase the situation until a certain point when the balancing loops start to take hold. In this case, there are some short-term balancing loops which have to do with flexibility options and recovery options which are longer-term. And this contribute to this part here. So what I did is started to work with them identifying what those feedback loops were. And the feedback loops could either be reinforcing or balancing feedback loops. And here's an example of 1 reinforcing loop and 3 balancing loops, just as an example. But this grew to contain the 12 loops that eventually made up the model. So this is an overall view of the model, which had to do with a combination of resources and its own feedback structure here. The intangible assets, which in this case was the intellectual property, and its own feedback structure here, and how these two, the resources and the intangible assets, interact both with the customers through the sales and with the performance management system, which is to do with the profit and the profit deficit. So in order to simulate this, I concentrated on the resources and the customers and intangible assets, generating this initial model, which is the one that was simulated. And this model had as a stocks demand, marketing, and exclusive IP. And this generated some behavior which looked very much like the sales and profit gap that we had seen from them. And we could see how this varies when we changed aspects of the marketing efforts, customers, for example, and marketing time. So these are just some of the variables in the system that we can use to play around and see how it behaves and which are relevant and which are not. One of the things that you can find from literature is that system dynamic models, especially as they grow very complex, there's only a very small set of variables that are actually relevant in changing the system behavior. Many of them, you can vary them widely by orders of magnitude, and it won't vary that much. So that's a way also of identifying maybe a different level of aggregation is necessary. So this is the comparison between what the model was giving and what information we got from the case study. So in order to answer research sub-question number 4, we looked at the compartmentalization, static framework, and historical dependence, and we see that both of the methods, the systemic risk analysis and the dynamic simulation, contribute to the compartmentalization because they understand components and relationships, and this is not compartmentalized, but it can be modularized, for example. They address the static aspect. The system risk analysis considers the unsafe control actions and timing in the unsafe control actions, while the dynamic simulation has time as an intrinsic result of the behavior of the system that you are simulating. And historical dependence is bound. It is necessary up to some point, but not that much, because there's experience to identify context here, although there are experiences where that is not as necessary. And in the case of dynamic simulations, there is a study required to identify parameters. But the model can be, through a Bayesian approach, for example, you can have a certain parameter, and that parameter can adjust itself according to how the model compares to what's actually happening in real life. So this historicity is only for the beginning. A Bayesian analysis would address that. But that's what we found in this research, at least. So with that, we are giving an answer to research sub-question 4. And with that, we can go to what contributions are we giving to the theory, or am I giving to the theory? First of all, there is a contribution to the accident mechanism. So how do cyber attacks happen, or a proposal of how cyber attacks happen, and how this digital attack is converted into a physical event. By using what's called the structural theory of accidents, but using that theory to supply chains. That is something that hadn't been done before. It's based on the systems approach to accident analysis, which is the model developed by Nancy Leveson, and also advancing and proposing the theory of endogenous exposure, which has to do with how the structure of the system creates its own attack. The attack is a consequence of the structure of the system. And also, it's an initial systemic theory for cyber resilience. So this is the beginning of the theory of how the resilience of a system can be explained through the mechanisms that underlie that response. Second, there are mechanisms that contribute to a resilient response. First of all, we are using systems theory in supply chain, which is something that had not been done for the case of cyber attacks. And we also based the system dynamics approach in simulation. So we are proposing to use simulation to understand the mechanisms that underlie a resilient response. And we are describing the cyber risks with respect to other supply chain risks, with evidence that is needed for a resilience theory that is beyond risk analysis. So a resilience theory concentrates on the objectives of the company instead of concentrating on the threats, outside threats, which is the risk. And also the theory of resilience based on an endogenous exposure. And another thing that came across here is a contribution to the case study methods and some of the shortcomings of the study method, particularly when it has to do with how it understands dynamics. The case study methods understands dynamics as far as the relationships that exist between the agents over time. But dynamics is something that is deeper than that. It has to do with accumulations, circular causality in terms of feedback loops, and resulting delays, the things that the case method does not consider at all. So this is something that comes out of the work. The contributions to academia are methodological in terms of using system risk analysis in supply chains, using system dynamics also for the simulation of cyber events, which had not been done before, and information sources beyond scientific literature, which is a proposal of the thesis and something that needs to be advanced, but at least is being proposed as a necessary way to go. Because of the quick cycle of events and how cyber attacks are advancing very quickly. There is a strategic contribution to academia which has to do with the gaps in the cyber resilience literature. I uncovered some of the gaps. I followed and tried to research some of the gaps that I uncovered in the literature review. There are some others which have not been addressed, and therefore that's something that can be pursued. And there is the dynamic information gathering during case studies. The way in which case studies are being done today, we are leaving information on the table that could be used to characterize dynamically over time what had happened in a company. And resilience as an emergent property. So resilience is something that results from the structure and can only be apparent at one level of aggregation and not at a smaller level of aggregation. And another important thing is mental models as a source of quantifiable data. There is a lot of information in people's heads, and we are not using that today. This proposes a way in which we can get this experience out, quantify it, and use it to improve the system. And to industry, they should prepare their organizations for response. So they cannot prepare for all the possible risks necessarily. There is a method for resilient design. And there's something called endogenous exposure, which allows companies to identify how open they are to attacks. And another important thing is managers as organizational designers. So they are not merely driving the ship, they can define the ship themselves. But for that, they need the tools, and that's what we are trying to provide them with here. So they are beyond organizational executors, and they have to use, or they will benefit from using systems thinking tools. What follows from here is exploring the other gaps of cyber resilience that I did not explore in this thesis, and the consolidation of the systemic risk analysis approach in supply chains. That's something I want to do. Through, for example, the cyber ship project, which is being done here at the university, and developing case studies, gathering dynamic data with the companies we are going to be working with, and simulating for policy formulation now. And also disseminating the system risk approach through system dynamics in management engineering and education, and publications about endogenous exposure approach to resilience design. So designing the resilience that a company has. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. So now we'll take a 10 minutes break. And there are some